Before we start this show, I want to mention the GA hurricane relief efforts underway for hard-hit Tennessee and North Carolina. Back in 2017, we interviewed Doug Jackson, the founder of Operation Airdrop, and they are back in operation this week, providing relief to communities that have had their roads cut off and can only be reached by air. Right now, they need donations of supplies, monetary donations, and the following kinds of volunteers: pilots with an aircraft, pilots without an aircraft, and general volunteers. And on their Facebook page, they posted this update that says, "Our operations base is now set up at Concord Regional Airport, and flight operations will begin on Monday, September 30th. We're calling on volunteer pilots to get ready to deploy. Multiple destinations are set, with Asheville Regional, AVL, being our largest, and other locations that are in need. For those delivering ground donations, our drop-off location is at the Walmart near the Concord Regional Airport in North Carolina." It says they've also secured a 75 cents per gallon discount for those who are flying the Operation Airdrop relief missions. And to sign up, they encourage you to go to their website at operation-airdrop.com. And of course, we'll include a link to that in our show notes. And now for our show. Sadly, this past weekend, there were 2 fatal crashes of Cirrus SR22 aircraft, and both were landing accidents. On Friday, September 27th, there was a fatal crash of November 831 Alpha Zulu, a Cirrus SR22 in the traffic pattern at Provo, Utah. And the next day on Saturday, November 1281 Foxtrot crashed while landing at First Flight Airport in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, reportedly killing 5 people, including a child. Both crashes included 2 attempts to land and a go-around in between, though the go-arounds don't appear to have been directly related to the crashes. And from the ADS-B data, well, it appears that both aircraft got slow, stalled, and crashed. We'll talk primarily about the crash in Utah, which occurred when the aircraft got slow on base and had a stall spin accident. And what's very revealing in the data is the aircraft's prior traffic pattern, in which the airspeed they flew never stabilized in the traffic pattern. We'll talk today about why that's an issue and how it leads to accidents such as these. And much about what we'll talk about applies to most GA aircraft, not just the Cirrus. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. 2 weeks ago in episode 349, we talked with Nicholas Jane about his purchase of a new-to-him Cirrus SR22 and our flight together moving his new airplane from California to Missouri. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/349. And if you're new to this show, take a moment right now, in whatever app you're using to listen to us, touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Spotify or Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And the next time you go to buy more headsets, get the only headset I've been using for the past 25 years, the Lightspeed headsets. Now, I love my Delta Zulu for its built-in CO monitor, and because I can tune its frequency response to match my hearing loss, which makes it a little easier for me to understand ATC. And when you buy a Lightspeed, they'll send us a check to support the show, but only if you first go to our website at aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. And just a quick update, I missed getting a show out last week for the first time in 14 months, and thanks to everyone who emailed to see if I was okay. I had 2 back-to-back 6-day trips flying around the western U.S. with owners of new Cirrus Vision jets. And when I got home a week ago on Friday, I was feeling a little under the weather, so I did a self-test for COVID, and wouldn't you know, it turned up positive. Now, if you're wondering about the other pilot, when we first met up on Monday, that pilot had a slight cough, which they attributed to something they caught from their kids, but that it wasn't a big deal. By Wednesday, that cough was really bad, so we both masked up for the remaining 3 days. Oddly, that pilot did not test positive. The upshot is, I've had to cancel training flights and another Vision Jet trip this past week, but now a week later, I'm feeling nearly fully recovered. Also, I wanted to mention the Midair collision that occurred in the traffic pattern at Minden Tahoe Airport, KMEV, in Minden, Nevada on September 16th. It involved a CAP Cessna 206 and a Globe Swift. The pilots in the 206 survived, but the pilot in the Swift died. The pilots in the 206 said that after the Swift announced that he was entering the traffic pattern, they searched desperately for that aircraft and noted that there were no targets being displayed on their in-cockpit traffic system. Now, someone who knew the deceased pilot wrote online that the pilot didn't like having to show his aircraft position and often flew with his ADS-B out turned off. I just want to remind everyone that regardless of your feelings about ADS-B, if you choose to install it, then you are required to follow the rules surrounding its use. One of those rules is 91.225F, and it says, except as prohibited in paragraph H2 of this section, each person operating an aircraft equipped with ADS-B out must operate this equipment in the transmit mode at all times, unless. So the basic rule is that you must leave ADS-B out on at all times. You are not allowed to turn it off. The only exceptions are 1, when authorized by the FAA, when the aircraft is performing a sensitive government mission for national defense, homeland security, intelligence, or law enforcement, or 2, unless otherwise directed by ATC, when transmitting would jeopardize the safe execution of ATC functions. So if it proves true that this aircraft was equipped with ADS-B out and that it was turned off, well, then essentially this pilot would have killed himself through his negligence and anti-authority attitude, and he narrowly avoided killing 2 other pilots. So please, if you sometimes fly with your ADS-B out turned off, stop doing that. Don't let an anti-authority attitude get in the way of safety, both for you, your passengers, and other pilots. Now let's talk about the crash of November 831 Alpha Zulu, a Cirrus SR22 at Provo, Utah on Friday. The crash apparently was captured on video, though I haven't seen it. It occurred while the aircraft was in the traffic pattern for runway 13, and it occurred almost immediately after the aircraft turned onto the base leg. The aircraft took off that morning at about 8:30 a.m. from St. George, Utah, which is where the aircraft was based. It flew north for about an hour and a half to Provo and entered, as instructed, the traffic pattern for runway 13. The traffic pattern was relatively busy, and the controller sequenced a relatively slow light sport cruiser in front of the Cirrus. The Cirrus turned on final just 0.8 nautical miles behind the sport cruiser and started catching up with that aircraft because it was initially 20 knots faster. I'll talk more about that spacing in a moment. Eventually, the Cirrus pilot was just 0.3 nautical miles behind the sport cruiser, and the tower instructed the Cirrus to go around. At its lowest point, just before the runway threshold, it was about 125 feet above the field elevation. It overflew the runway and turned an early right crosswind to rejoin the right downwind. Since the aircraft flew 2 traffic patterns, we can compare how consistent he was. The first approach was notable in that the pilot never flew a stabilized airspeed in the pattern. 2 of the criteria for a stable approach are flying at a consistent airspeed with relatively little movement of the throttle. The Cirrus IFOM, or Flight Operations Manual, says that the downwind is to be flown at 100 knots, the base at 90 knots, and the final at 80 knots. Winds at the surface were calm at the time of the accident, so the ground speeds I'm about to give you are probably close to the aircraft's true airspeed. The altitudes I'm going to give you are about 300 feet higher than the ones you'll find on aircraft traffic websites because I've corrected the altitudes for the non-standard barometric pressure at Provo. On the first approach, as the aircraft was inbound on the 45, when the aircraft was 3 miles out, it was at 7,600 feet MSL and 143 knots. Traffic pattern altitude is 5,500 feet, so he was 2,100 feet above the TPA while 3 miles out on the 45. The FAA says we should be at pattern altitude when we're on the 45, though it doesn't specify at what point along the 45 we should be at traffic pattern altitude. Over the next 3 miles, the plane dropped to 5,800 feet and 128 knots as it joined the downwind. Over the next 40 seconds, the aircraft speed decreased continually to 104 knots and 5,650 feet, about 150 feet above traffic pattern altitude, before turning base. On the base leg, the airspeed decreased from 104 knots to 99 knots, which was relatively consistent, though 10 knots above the Cirrus target airspeed of 90 knots on base. On the final, the airspeed increased briefly to 101 knots, but then decreased continually to 76 knots near the threshold without ever once stabilizing at a particular airspeed. So it started the final at 21 knots above the target airspeed and ended at 4 knots below the target airspeed. We'll talk in a few minutes about why you don't want to fly with a continually decreasing airspeed And by the way, that is exactly what we saw with the DA-42 that crashed at AirVenture in July. And now here's the ATC audio for the Cirrus's first approach. I've eliminated some of the gaps in transmissions from other aircraft to save you time in listening to it. Note that both the tower controller and the Cirrus pilot didn't appear to be at the top of their game. The Cirrus called in twice before being acknowledged and didn't give the tower any information when he first checked in. On the go-around, he talked about runway 33 while in the traffic pattern for 13. There were long delayed responses from the tower, perhaps because he was doing other things, such as working the ground frequency. Also, the tower controller was sometimes garbling his words, making them a little hard to understand. Here's the audio.
Provo Tower, Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu, about 5 miles southwest of the field.
Object 94, Provo, ground, runway 13, taxi Alpha. Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu, Provo Tower.
This is Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu, go ahead.
Lieutenant Roger. Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, Provo Tower, say request.
Sorry, go ahead, Tower for Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu.
Crew check, 613, cross on Alpha, GRP Alpha Charlie.
Car 48 on Alpha, back to the ramp, Alpha Charlie, crew check 615.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, continue, runway 13.
Continue on to runway 13 for Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu.
Archer 96 Foxtrot, frequency change approved.
Frequency change approved for Archer 96 Foxtrot.
Wolf 30, frequency change approved.
Frequency change approved, Wolf 30.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, if able, extend down for a 4-mile right base, following a sport cruiser 2-mile final.
We can do a 4-mile downwind, no problem for Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, Roger, thank you for sport cruiser in sight.
I'm sorry, report what in sight.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, report the sport cruiser 2-mile final in sight.
I don't see them yet, but we are looking for them for 831 Alpha Zulu.
Jet 94, I'll be ready when you are.
249, continue runway 18.
Tower 831 Alpha Zulu has the plane in sight.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, Roger, base turn approved, your discretion, runway 13, clear to land.
Base turn approved and cleared for land for Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu.
Subject 94 Pro Tower, hold short, runway 13, traffic, landing roll.
Holding short 13, okay.
Cheers, Angel Delta, fire base.
Hey, you'll come by base, H3 Delta.
449 Pro Tower, hold short, runway 18.
Hold short 18, 149.
Light short, diner, Whiskey Delta, straight west on turn.
149 Whiskey Delta, say again. Provo Tower, light sport 149 Whiskey Delta, say again.
Lead light 17, go right for traffic trail. Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, go around aircraft at runway.
Tower, I think go around for 831 Alpha Zulu because that guy's still on our runway. We're going around now, be focused. Provo Tower, helicopter 77 unit from hotel, 6 to the southeast, X-ray, full stop.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, are you able to turn right to back to the downwind?
Yep, I can turn right and go back on downwind for 831 Alpha Zulu.
Cheers, 8 Julie Delta, follow IC south, reaching on 10 tanks.
No worries, we'll flip it around, follow I-15 south, 8 Julie Delta.
Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, Roger, report downwind, runway 13.
Report downwind, you take the 33?
Provo Tower, Arrow 29904, Romeo, ILS 13, requesting a low approach.
Provo Tower, helicopter 77 unit from hotel, 5 to the southeast, X-ray, full stop.
Lights 49, Whiskey Delta, resume navigation, free space route.
149, Whiskey Delta, resume home navigation, frequency change approved. Thanks for your help, good day.
We're going to get Jet 94 out of here.
Jet 94, we're waiting for a leave. Cirrus 1 Alpha Zulu, runway 13, clear to land.
Cirrus 831 Alpha Zulu, clear to land, runway 13. Tower Sky, take car full part. Mike, number 2 for tech for 1-3. Please Tom support.
Falconer 7 Uniform Delta for Tower 4 South Point.
4 South Point, hello, number 7, Uniform Delta.
6344 Mike, Provo Tower holds for 103.
Okay, Tower 1-3, 4 Mike. Provo Tower, Arrow 299 for Romeo, ILS 13 requesting low approach departure northbound.
Tower 294 Romeo, Provo Tower, number 2 flying Cirrus, 1 mile right base, runway 13, clear low approach. After low approach, left turn northbound approach.
Clear 13 approach, left turn out to the north, 299 for Romeo.
294 Romeo. Do you have the Cirrus in sight on a mile half right base?
Cirrus is 94 Romeo.
294 Romeo, thank you.
That Cirrus tower just crashed at the Utah Lake, about a 2-mile base.
294 Romeo.
Yeah, you have to go circle the crash so you can find it. It's Tower 9 for Romeo, standing by if you guys need any help from us.
294 Romeo, I think. Just one on Zulu Pro Tower.
The pilot's second time around the pattern was in some respects better than the first traffic pattern. The aircraft climbed a traffic pattern altitude and stayed at that altitude until he was well beyond the key position on downwind to beam the 1-3 numbers. Airspeed control again was not great. Initially on downwind, the aircraft was at 108 knots, accelerating to 120 knots to beam the numbers. After the numbers, the airspeed started decreasing while the altitude barely decreased. From a beam the numbers, the airspeed went from 120 knots down to 86 knots as the aircraft started turning base. During that time, it only descended about 75 feet, which tells me that the pilot reduced the power because he was fast, but didn't lower the nose enough. So again, the aircraft never stabilized at any speed, much less at the 100 knots that it should have been at. As the aircraft turned base, the aircraft decelerated very rapidly. In just 9 seconds, as the aircraft was turning base, the aircraft decelerated from 86 knots to 70 knots. So it was now 20 knots slower than its target speed for base and 10 knots slower than the target speed for final. At that point, it apparently stalled and spun. An eyewitness said the aircraft made 2 full turns before crashing into Utah Lake. The airframe was apparently badly damaged, and the parachute was visible on the surface. It's unknown whether the pilot deployed the parachute at too low an altitude or if the chute was deployed by the impact of the plane hitting the water. When I'm teaching on a Cirrus aircraft, I often see aircraft get slow on base, and here's what's usually going on. Cirrus says that we should select full 100% flaps on base. Often when pilots add flaps, if they do nothing else, the nose comes up to a nearly level attitude and the aircraft starts to slow dramatically. That's the most common reason I see aircraft slowing at that point, and there's a really easy fix for it. I teach pilots that whenever they add flaps in a Cirrus, they should simultaneously push forward on the stick and push forward on the electric trim switch for about 2 seconds. If you do that, the nose will remain in the same nose low pitch attitude that you want to maintain throughout the traffic pattern. If you don't push forward and or add trim, the nose will come up and you will get slow. Now, please remember that simple tip. When you add flaps, add trim. And this works in many other aircraft types as well. It was first demonstrated to me by the local Diamond dealer in my very first Diamond DA-40 flight soon after I became a CFI. The pilot was a pro pilot who flew citations for a living, and I'm indebted for this very simple tip he showed me over 20 years ago. It's very effective. Each time you add flaps, push on the yoke and add trim. Failure to do that is the number one reason I see pilots who are trained by other CFIs get slow in the traffic pattern. There's also another reason pilots sometimes get slow during turns in the traffic pattern. We've all been taught that when we make a level turn, we should apply some back pressure on the stick or yoke so the aircraft doesn't lose altitude in a turn. The problem is that in descending turns, such as those you'd make in the traffic pattern, pilots sometimes pull back too much during the turn, and then they get slow. Though with the Cirrus pilots I've observed, failure to push forward on the stick and add trim is by far the bigger issue when pilots are flying the traffic pattern. And now let's talk about how the accident pilot flew a constantly decreasing airspeed and never stabilized at any one speed in the traffic pattern. As I mentioned, this is exactly what happened with the DA-42 that crash landed at AirVenture in July. That aircraft also flew a base and final legs at a continually decreasing unstabilized airspeed until it stalled perhaps 20 feet in the air and came crashing down onto the runway. Now, there are many criteria for a stable approach. The one most people remember is that you want to remain at a constant descent angle on final approach. In other words, you want to remain on the VASI or other visual glide slope. But that's just one criteria for a stable approach. Another is flying at a consistent airspeed with relatively little movement of the throttle. And you might ask, well, why is that important? If I arrive at the runway at the right speed, what's the big deal if my airspeed is continually decreasing as I fly along a normal descent path to the runway? Well, there are a number of issues with it, and the main one is directly related to this accident. The pilot never stabilized at any one airspeed. His speed was constantly changing. One benefit of flying at a stable, trimmed airspeed is that you can look away from the airspeed indicator for longer periods of time, and guess what happens when you do? Not much. Your airspeed remains relatively constant. By contrast, if you're not at a stable airspeed and your speed is constantly changing the traffic pattern, you have to spend more time monitoring the airspeed. And if you don't look back frequently, perhaps because of a distraction or a heavy workload, you can end up getting slow and stalling, which is essentially what happened to this aircraft. Here are some other disadvantages of not flying with a stabilized airspeed. As airspeed decreases, an aircraft becomes less responsive to control inputs. If your aircraft is constantly decreasing in airspeed, you'll need to be constantly increasing the amount of control input you use to get a desired response from the plane. However, if you're flying at a constant speed, the response to a given control input remains the same while you're at that airspeed. Maintaining a consistent glide path is harder when the airspeed is changing. A continually decreasing speed will affect the descent rate. This can make it hard to stay on the proper glide slope, increasing the likelihood of a high or low approach. A non-stabilized approach with continual speed changes dramatically increases pilot workload. You're constantly adjusting power, pitch, and trim, leaving less mental capacity for other tasks such as monitoring traffic, communicating with ATC, or watching for runway conditions. And finally, a constantly decreasing airspeed makes it more difficult to manage the energy state of the aircraft. If the airspeed gets too low, the aircraft could lose the energy needed to flare properly, potentially leading to a hard landing or even a stall on short final, which is what happened to the DA-42 at AirVenture. I've never understood why CFIs and pilots think that this type of flying is acceptable. I often fly with pilots who've been trained in a Cirrus by other CFIs, and they seem to feel it's perfectly acceptable to have the airspeed decrease continually in the traffic pattern. I'll often see pilots who are 10 knots below target airspeed because they were at 90 knots as they began the base and they're at 80 knots at the end of the base. That's just sloppy flying. Now, this crash is also notable as the plane involved was serial number 3, one of the first flying Cirrus SR22s. Thus, it's an original G1 aircraft, though they weren't called that at the time. I've looked at photos of it that were posted when it was sold in 2021, and at that time it had the original round gauge panel with a Sandel HSI. It's possible that the new owners upgraded it with a new instrument panel. It's also been repainted. Interestingly, older Cirrus aircraft have much higher accident rates than newer versions, and not just slightly higher, much higher. The original G1 aircraft with the round gauges, before the PFD was introduced in 2003, have by far the highest accident rates. The next group of Avidyne-equipped airplanes, built from 2003 through 2008, have a much lower accident rate, but that accident rate is much higher than the next group of airplanes, the first Perspective-equipped aircraft that were built starting in mid-2008. And the accident rate drops again for Perspective Plus-equipped aircraft built starting in 2017. When this data first started appearing years ago on the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association forum, people said things like, yes, but aircraft built 20 years ago have been around longer, and so they're more likely to have been involved in an accident, which is true. Also, the rate depends upon the number of aircraft built in any particular year, and those numbers have gone up and down with the economy. So I took all of that data, put it in a spreadsheet, and normalized it by dividing by the number of aircraft built in each year and by the number of years each of those aircraft had been in service. And guess what? The effect was still the same. Older airplanes have dramatically higher accident rates, for reasons that we can only guess. Now, the airframes themselves are substantially the same as they were 20 years ago, so I don't think those changes to the airframe account for the large differences we see. What I do believe is that people who buy cheaper, older airplanes probably have less money to spend on training. So I think the large difference in the accident rate between the old and the newer airplanes is largely a result in differences in training. Now, for sure, there are many new safety innovations that have been introduced over the years, and there's no way to definitively prove exactly why these older airplanes have higher accident rates. But my recommendation for people flying any aircraft that's new to them is that they get the best possible training from CFIs who have lots of experience in that particular aircraft type in which they're learning. Now let's talk about the 0.8 nautical mile spacing this pilot had on final and how it decreased to 0.3 nautical miles prior to the go-around. That certainly wasn't directly related to the accident, but it does highlight a common issue pilots have flying faster airplanes such as the Cirrus. When you fly a faster airplane at a busy airport, there's a good chance that you'll be sequenced in behind a slower aircraft in the traffic pattern. But remember this, the controller is responsible for the sequence in which aircraft fly the traffic pattern, but the pilot is responsible for the separation between his or her aircraft and the aircraft in front of them. Most of the time when I see pilots have to do a go-around, it's because they didn't do a good job of managing the separation between themselves and the aircraft in front of them. And because they failed to maintain adequate separation, they had to go around. And that's all part of situational awareness. You need to be constantly aware of what's going on around you, and knowing your separation from the aircraft in front of you is part of that awareness. I'm lucky in that when I fly, I'm almost always in a plane with ADS-B in traffic, and I can tell within a few tenths of a mile how far I am away from the aircraft in front of me in the pattern. And I can also tell how fast that aircraft is, so I can start creating the separation I need between myself and the plane in front of me. Generally, I try to always maintain 2 miles of separation between my aircraft and the one in front of me. If I do that, I'm practically guaranteed to not have to go around, even if the preceding aircraft does a full stop and spends a lot of time on the runway. If I'm 2 miles behind the aircraft and it's a much slower aircraft and my separation decreases to 1.5 miles on final, I'm still going to be fine. However, if that separation slips to a mile, then things will still be fine if the preceding aircraft does a touch and go, but there's a chance I might have to go around if they do a full stop. Pilots are often taught that, when on downwind, they can turn base once the preceding aircraft passes by them on final. That works well for aircraft that have matched speeds, but I find it doesn't work well if I'm in a faster aircraft. When I'm on downwind, I wait until the traffic display shows that the aircraft that passed me on final is 1.5 miles away from me. We'll gain a little more distance on base and we'll probably still be about 2 miles behind the preceding aircraft. When flying a full traffic pattern behind a slower aircraft, I'll start creating separation by flying a longer upwind or departure leg than the preceding aircraft. If I'm a lot faster, I'll also fly a wider downwind. That way, if I catch up with the airplane, I'm not right behind him, but I'm outside of him. If necessary, I'll fly a longer downwind to create more space. And when I'm on final, I immediately slow to approach speed or short field landing speed. I'm always amazed when flying with pilots who are following another slower aircraft that they don't slow to approach speed immediately upon turning final. By not slowing immediately, they're reducing the separation from the preceding aircraft and increasing the chances they'll need to go around. Now, since the accident aircraft at Provo was one of the oldest Cirrus aircraft flying, it might not have had a good traffic system in it, and so the accident pilot would have lacked a vital tool for maintaining adequate separation in the traffic pattern. But he also hurt himself by not immediately slowing to approach speed. The aircraft in front of him had been referred to as a light sport aircraft, so he should have known that it would be slower than him. Yet, although he started the final at 99 knots, it took him a full minute to slow to 79 knots, all the while he was gaining on the aircraft ahead of him. Most likely the pilot was a newer pilot. I've read online that the plane was purchased by multiple owners who bought the plane to learn to fly. The pilot, a 43-year-old male, got his medical in 2021 and his pilot certificate was updated in December 2023, probably with the instrument rating shown on his certificate. So it's credible he'd only been flying for 2 to 3 years. Also, his home airport, St. George, is a non-towered field, so it's possible that most of his flying was done at non-towered airports with less traffic in the pattern where he rarely had to worry about his separation from preceding aircraft. Avionics tools and experience matter, In this case, it's quite possible the pilot lacked a tool that would show his distance to the preceding aircraft, and that he didn't have a lot of experience following slower aircraft in busy traffic patterns. The pilot was also flying with a 46-year-old male passenger who lived just a few miles from the pilot's base in St. George. That passenger doesn't appear to have been pilot rated, and so might not have been able to help the pilot with the workload of landing at a busy airport. One thing I find that GA pilots are not very conscientious about is maintaining a sterile cockpit when they're in the vicinity of an airport taking off or landing. Now, the sterile cockpit rule doesn't apply to us as Part 91 pilots, but we should still use it to make our cockpit safer. It's easy for pilots to get distracted while talking with passengers and to overlook critical factors such as a declining airspeed approaching stall speed. I used the rule just 2 weeks ago while flying with two 737 pilots who were buying a Vision jet, and I said aloud, "Now let's have a sterile cockpit." We were in Southern California being vectored for an instrument approach. I knew they both had lots of questions about the airplane, but it was not the time to be asking those questions. Likewise, when flying a busy traffic pattern, it's not the time to be chit-chatting with passengers. You need to be focused on the task at hand, because our human brains, no matter how good yours may be, can't do parallel processing. And if you're yakking away with a passenger or even a pilot-rated passenger, that gives you less time and fewer brain cycles to deal with the flying task. So there's lots to be learned from this accident. The most important lesson is that airspeed is life, and you don't want to get too slow and stall in the traffic pattern. And part of the way you do that is by adding trim each time you add flaps, and to have a target airspeed for each leg of the traffic pattern, and to fly those legs at your targeted speeds rather than just let your speed continually decrease all the time as you fly the traffic pattern. And now let me mention that this is a listener-supported show and that we have lots of ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you can find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until you're silent, baby, sliding upside down.